just their explosive behaviour and their feeding patterns that I think all of us sort of come to love in that really skinny stuff, and gets us spending days dragging kayaks and canoes over rocks and in through the scrub and getting covered in multi-bites to go and be a part of it all.
Folks, it's Friday once again, the most welcome day of the week, but not only that, it's the last Friday before the bass season opens in those running water systems along the east coast of Australia, so very exciting. And today we are putting some effort into going bassing in the skinny water with Gold Coast fisho and repeat podcast guest John Costello. So folks, let's get the intro music knocked over and then we can start talking to John.
This is the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, where we share the secrets of Australia's lure fishing gurus every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And now here's your host, Greg Vinyl from doclures.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 261 of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. I'm Greg Doclures Vinyl. Great to have you here. Another episode of the show. My job, of course, is to bring you some of Australia's best and brightest lure fishers to share a few secrets with us and help you and I to catch some more fish on lures just like our guests do. Now, today's guest has been on the show before. He's well qualified to be on the show, though. It's John Costello from the Gold Coast, and we're going to talk to him shortly about skinny water bass fishing in southeast Queensland. It's a really fun episode. As always, John has some amazing insights to share, and he does so in style. But before we get on to John's show, now folks, a couple of weeks ago, I floated the idea of starting a Doc Lures community, Team Doc Lures, for those who'd like to contribute to the podcast and help me to continue to run the show and to grow and expand it and make sure the content is more targeted and relevant to the people who really appreciate it. And I got amazing support for that idea. So I'm pleased to say that I've actually gone ahead and set up the Team Doc Lures community, and you can go over and check it out at team.doclures.com. So that's team, team.doclures.com. Now, the community isn't for everybody. If you're not interested in being part of it, that's absolutely fine. The podcast will continue on in its current format. It'll continue to be free. But if you would like to join up and you would like to get a little bit more information, you'd like to get a bit more interaction with me personally or with some of my guests, you'd like more pro tips and stuff that I'm not bringing into the main podcast that I do publicly, then this is your opportunity to get involved. Not only is it your opportunity to get involved, but if you're listening to this before the 6th of September 2020, it's also your opportunity to get your dad involved, because I'm doing a 2-for-1 deal up until Father's Day. If you sign up, as long as you stay a member, your dad can be a member as well. So zap over to team.doclures.com and see what that's all about. But let's get back to today's program. So today, as I said, we're talking to John Costello. Now, John runs a YouTube page called My Lure Box, and he's got a website by the same name. He's one of those people who is just extremely knowledgeable about lure fishing. He's reviewed literally hundreds of different lures on his website and his YouTube. He's put together videos on fishing from kayaks, about fishing for various species around southeast Queensland, and all kinds of stuff. There's some amazing resources there. John and I are kindred spirits in that we are both very, very passionate about helping people catch more fish on lures. And I'll tell you what, John pumps out some amazing stuff that really will help you to do exactly that. So zap over to My Lure Box on YouTube or mylurebox.com.au on Google and you'll find John there. But for the moment, folks, we have John all to ourselves for the next 45 minutes or so talking about skinny water bassing in the southeast Queensland area. So I think it's time we get started. Let's bring John to the microphone and make it happen, Captain. John Costello, welcome back to the ALF podcast, mate. Looking forward to a great session talking about Australian bass in the southeast Queensland area, mate, in the river systems, steering away from the lakes and going into that skinny water.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. It's great to be back on, mate. Bass fishing with lures is pretty much where it all started for me way back as a boy. So getting back onto this topic after having a couple of chances to speak with you on others is really good, mate. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, mate, you blew us away with Mangrove Jack. You blew us away with Flathead. And I've actually had a number of people who said, we need to get John Costello back on the show to talk bass. So I'm stoked that you are here and stoked to hear that this is the species that you cut your teeth on. Mate, tell us a bit about what bass mean to you, mate. What is it that appeals about targeting bass, particularly in those river systems?
Yeah, look, I think it's a real tribute to the great Australian bass, mate, that they just take such a variety of lures, and there's so many different ways that you can go after them and get good numbers of fish that as a sports fishing species, for anyone that's even learning, right from the first couple of sessions when you go out and you're trying to piece the puzzle together, right through to these tournament anglers or guys that have done it their whole life. There's that opportunity to learn things, and then there's the real challenge of trying to keep working these fish out. And then once you hook one, it's always like your first. They've got that adrenaline junkie style to them with their behaviour, the way they rip your line and drag you back into this snag. And there's so much to learn about this and bass that, even 20 years on, for me, and I'm sure it's a lot longer for a lot of other blokes, especially some of the guys that I've listened to in some of your other podcasts on bass, there's a whole lot to love about it, mate. So I'm really excited to give my take on it in the skinny stuff. It's going to be good.
Yeah, and I've really been looking forward to this episode, mate, I have to say, because, look, I love impoundment bass fishing. It's not something I've done a huge amount of, but when I have, I've really enjoyed it. But if I had to choose a place to go and target bass, it's always going to be in the running water, mate. I'm not so worried about the size of the fish. I just love that running water environment. I love their habits in flowing water and the way they feed and how they tend to be aggressive and hard pulling and all that kind of stuff. I have to say, though, and you've heard me say this before and others have heard me say it as well, river bass are not something that you should be putting in the bag and taking home. If you want to feed a fish, go target something else. River bass are definitely worth preserving and protecting. They're a fish that's too good to catch just once.
Yeah, I totally agree. I can't remember if I've ever taken a wild bass, and caring for them, releasing them, looking after them while you've got them out of the water for a photo, that's all really important. And a big part of the reason why they have been pressured over the years with weirs or dammings and things like that. But I think that the Australian bass fishing community are behind it, and they're doing the right things to look after the numbers of fish and keep paying licenses or keeping those fish stocks healthy and appreciating the beautiful fisheries that we've got down the East Coast especially. It's great. So I feel exactly the same, and it's just their explosive behaviour and their feeding patterns that I think all of us sort of come to love in that really skinny stuff, and gets us spending days dragging kayaks and canoes over rocks and in through the scrub and getting covered in multi-bites to go and be a part of it all.
And with a big smile all over your face the whole time you're doing it as you're clambering through the mud covered in mozzies. Look, and you hit the nail right on the head, mate. It's not just the fishing pressure. And when I say always release wild bass, it's not just about the fishing pressure. There's so many other pressures on them. And one of the things you mentioned there is they are a migratory species. The habitats have been modified. So fish passage is a big issue for this species, because if they can't get down into the estuaries to spawn, then the numbers start to dwindle. And it doesn't take all that much of a barrier. So really important that we look after the stocks that are there and preserve and conserve them. And as I say, there's plenty of other species we can target for a feed. And there's no problem whatsoever. I've got no problem with anyone taking a feed, but just leave the wild bass alone is all I ask.
Yeah, they're too good just to catch that once, aren't they? They're very special.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. All right, mate, let's start to drill down a little bit on how our listeners can get involved in some skinny water bassing. And we're going to focus on the southeast Queensland area. We're going to focus, there's so many river systems there, so many creeks, and there's so many different ways, as you say, to fish for this species. So let's start out by, first of all, talking about how we might be able to find a place to go and target skinny water bass in southeast Queensland, maybe from the New South Wales border up to, I don't know, maybe the northern end of the Sunshine Coast, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So, like you said, they're a migratory species and they're spawning down in those estuarine waters, usually during those cooler months of the year. And then as the weather heats up and coming into summer, they're sort of moving up into those much smaller creek systems, up into the fresh water. And when you kind of get that knowledge of how they're moving throughout a year, and then you understand there's obviously those clear season periods that I think by the time this podcast comes to air, that's going to be finished and we'll be out the other side of it in maybe into September. Is that about right, Greg?
Yeah, look, I'm going to run this one towards the end of August. So for those who are waiting for the bass season to open, they don't have too long to wait once the podcast goes live. I'd like to prime people up for the opportunities as they're there. So yeah, we'll be looking at early September, early spring.
Okay.
So let's focus on how the systems are going to fish at that time of year.
Yeah, right. Okay. So with that in mind, if you're heading out in that sort of springtime period, you're going to have good numbers of bass in those lower freshwater reaches as some of those bigger fish start to want to move back up the system, or they're waiting for the big rain and the big runoff period to be able to get up into different pools as the season progresses. But generally, to find those spots, if you're starting from scratch, pick the main systems the longer systems that have got that influx of fresh water coming in during the rain periods. But then you want to be using your Google Maps and, a Vital Map or Queensland Globe to get really detailed pictures of where the pools are, and even looking for the way the vegetation and the topography of the land is going to be shifting, so that you can kind of predict where that fresh is going to start to meet the salt and that brackish water is going to be, and then how far up you can get, whether it's with a kayak or if you're going to have to jump in your car with a backpack and go and hike in and find some pools or drop a kayak in. And for me, mate, a lot of my fishing is done out of one or two kayaks, different styles of kayaks. And probably my favourite way of doing it is I've got an 11.5-foot kayak that I've got a cut down small Minn Kota motor that sits right between my legs. And I can steer that thing just with my feet. The little electric just humming along basically in silence on speed 1 or 2. And that just moves me up through those lower freshwater reaches just really efficiently. And it's probably one of the things that gives me a huge advantage when I'm chasing bass, flicking lures, is I can cover a lot of the bottom end water in complete silence and with a lot of stealth. And that puts me in a really good place to enjoy the morning. And usually I'm getting under some good fish doing it.
Yeah, super important, that stealth. Anytime you're fishing for anything in skinny water, of course, the fish are always on the alert.
Yeah.
So you do need to be stealthy. And I guess one of the things for me anyway with the skinny water bassing I've done, there's a few places where you can get in a boat, but generally speaking, this is a style of fishing where you're going to have to be prepared to put in a bit of physical effort to get to the spots, and it makes it all worthwhile. But you do have to do a bit of walking or do a bit of kayaking. You've got to be prepared to drag a kayak over rock or logs or whatever to get into places where boats can't get and that kind of thing. So it is a fairly physical form of fishing. Mate, when we're looking at Queensland Globe or Google Earth, you're saying we're looking for those areas where we get a change from freshwater to the brackish water. So we're looking for changes in vegetation. What else are we looking for in terms of, you've mentioned deep pools and bends. There are obviously places where there's a bit more depth and a bit more refuge for bass during the periods where there's lower flow or during the hotter part of the day. What else should we be looking for, mate? Are there any sort of key structures or key features we should be looking for?
Yeah, so obviously, like a lot of species, those deeper bends might be a signal for deeper water and areas where there's that turbulent flow and areas where bait's going to sit different stages. But look, for me, when I'm going around finding these spots, I love the areas where there's steep, heavy vegetation on the bank, and that provides so much of the food source for the bass, and especially that sort of sits perfectly with the way that I fish. So a lot of the time I fish a top water scenario, so I'm using top water lures or very shallow running lures, and I'm just pouring them in a lot faster than a lot of bass fishermen probably would. And like you mentioned right at the start, I'm not really too concerned with the size of these bass that I'm getting after in these skinny water. I'm really just looking for that adrenaline sort of fix and those crazy hits and just getting in touch with that behaviour. So anywhere where you've got huge vegetation that sort of leans in and falls in onto that skinny water, you're going to have, insects and poachers and, lizards and frogs and all of that life that's just flooding in from the banks, and it just creates a perfect opportunity for those bass to get super aggressive and take creature baits, whether it's a mouse or a grasshopper or a jitterbug or a soft-shelled cicada or something like that. That's really where it starts to ramp up. And I think when you're sitting at home or in your car listening to a podcast about putting in an effort and going to remote spots, it can seem like an effort, but I'll tell you, when you get your kayak off the roof and you're out there in amongst that long grass and you feel that sense of adventure and you're seeing those shadows cast over the creek, all of that effort falls away and you just get soaked up and swept into the whole atmosphere of it all, and you can lose yourself for a whole day doing it without too much trouble at all, mate.
When I lived on the Sunshine Coast, I used to love it because there are so many creeks around that part of the world. It's the same on the Gold Coast, and it's the same within a fairly short distance of the greater Brisbane area. There are so many places where you can go away and do this, where the bass will take surface lures right through the day, and you're right looking for anywhere there's vegetation. I mean, if you think about it, if you want to fish surface lures, what are you imitating? You're imitating terrestrial creatures that are falling on the water surface, generally speaking. So anywhere there's overhanging vegetation, that's where the bass are going to be looking for that, so it makes sense. But I guess there's so many spots I found where I could be maybe only 3 or 4 kilometres from a bustling metropolitan centre, and I may as well be on a different part of the planet. Can't hear any traffic. There's the birds all around you. You've got bass that you can see that you're casting to that are smashing lures off the surface, and it's just so therapeutic and so accessible.
Yeah, I agree. And I think people that have done this style of fishing are going to be our biggest advocates for this. The guys that maybe haven't got out and done it, or the girls that haven't gone and searched for that adventure in a skinny creek chasing bass that listen to this podcast, mate, they're missing a disconnect that's so accessible and then just such a gripping experience of using lures for super aggressive fish, especially around top water times, low light periods and things like that. That, mate, it's one of the real highlights. And you compare the size of a bass to some of the big fish that are on offer around the Gold Coast and offshore, and even a small 30-centimetre fish, the enjoyment I get out of pulling one of those off a snag or something like that, I'll keep preferring that over sometimes getting out offshore if the conditions are right for a bass. But there's a lot to be grateful for when we've got a bass fishery right on our doorstep around the corner. Yeah.
Absolutely well said. Couldn't agree more. Mate, let's talk about the best conditions and the factors that come together, I guess, to give us the best opportunity to get onto bass. So if you were to pick the weather, I mean, obviously, get out any time you can. This is one of the great things about this style of fishing. If you happen to live in southeast Queensland, as I know a lot of our listeners do, you can go out any time. You don't have to go far. If the fishing's not great, then spend a few hours and come home. You don't have a lot to lose. It's not going to cost you much. But if you were to pick those perfect conditions, what would they look like, mate? What really brings the bass on the chew?
For me, it starts even during winter in closed season. I'm just hanging for a big amount of water to come down through the system just to freshen things up a little bit and get the nutrients going. So we had that happen about 3 weeks ago. That allows a lot of the fish to come down and get their spawn on as well. And I think that anyone who lives and breeds bass fishing is just watching that whole period of time in the preparation for the season starting, and they're getting a gauge on how the season's going to look. So with that rainfall we've had mid-year, I think that's fantastic. Coming into the season when you're starting to eye in those conditions, you still want a little bit of life coming into the pools and things like that, or the bottom reaches. You want a little bit of flowing water. And if you're going to pick a particular day, you might have a couple of days behind it of fairly consistent weather. And I sort of like it when it's warming up during October, November, when there's still really big fish down the bottom in those bigger areas. You've got nice warm conditions. The hatches have started, and for me, I teach sport out on an oval, and I'll see the flies and the a lot of little hatches of different insects start to flood the oval, and that gets me really excited that it's coming into the right period of time. So you get some warm, consistent weather. You might have had rain or a little bit of run in the last few weeks, but it's not pouring in super dirty. And people talk about 10 to 20 bass a plenty, things like that. I tend to just get out there and get into it nice and early in the morning when there's heavy shadows being cast over. And usually when it's quiet, not too windy, because I just like not fighting the wind in the kayak, but something that's nice and quiet so I can enjoy my time on the water and really hone in on a lot of those little subtle things that you get to experience out there that help tune in your bass fishing. So whether it's the sound of the cicadas or the phones, or it might be just some dripping water that's coming in from a side creek or a feeder creek into the system. When it's nice and quiet and there's those little things that I can piece together, or, a surface hitting the bass early morning, right up under some lily pads or something that you can pick up a long distance away in those calm conditions, that's perfect for me. I just want to soak up the natures that's on show in the early morning out there. So that's when it gets me going, mate. That's it.
Yeah. Well said once again. And mate, I just want to be crystal clear here for those that are listening. We're not advocating fishing during the close season. What John's saying is keep an eye on the conditions, because you're watching to see what's coming in the coming weeks. So if you get a bit of rain, you get a bit of fresh water coming down, stirring things up, rising water levels, getting the water moving and getting the bait moving, all that kind of stuff in the lead up to season opening, then you're headed for a good start to the bass season. So we're definitely not advocating having a fish during the closed season, just to be clear.
Yeah, I need to be clear on that. Sorry, I was talking, that's someone frothing their bass fishing is eyeing in the conditions. They're not going fishing during it. They've got a lot more respect for the fishery than that. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we wouldn't expect anything less from you, mate, but I just wanted to make sure that our listeners fully understood that. So, John, look, that's fantastic. And look, you've given us a pretty good indication of when the bass are on the chew. I know that when I fished for them, right through the night is a great time to fish as well if you're in the right location. Oftentimes, of course, if you're getting into some remote places and you're bush bashing and paddling through snaggy, rocky areas and having to drag the kayak, you're not going to want to do that after dark. But if you are in a place where you do have a little bit easier access, then that night fishing could be quite good too.
Oh, mate, 100%. Yeah, go on.
You'd love your early mornings, but if you had a 24-hour period to spend on the bass, mate, tell us how that would pan out. How would you go about it? So you're starting first thing in the morning, you're fishing those long shadows. What do you do once the shadows start to disappear?
Yeah, mate, that's a great question, because when I talk about my favourite period of time, I'm not necessarily thinking about when everyone else can get there. I sort of hit it just before work and then I'll go and hit work. But if you're going out, I'm usually out there just before sun up. Like, it's still dark really when I'm putting the kayak in the water, and I'll try and fish topwater and surface lures for as long as they're feeding hard and hitting those lures. And I'm going to stay with topwater lures. But as the day changes, I tend to go deeper and deeper to try and chase that bite. And I think that as the sun gets higher in the sky, those bass have got big pupils. They're very light sensitive. And if there's edge cover, heavy edge cover or undercut banks where the shadows are dark all day long, you're still going to sneak a few good bass out of those during the middle of the day with a really accurate cast. But really a lot of those better fish especially are going to end up down deep as the day progresses. So it might be top water early, switch over if your bites are becoming a little bit more subtle or you're getting bass turn on the lure without crashing straight through it, then I might go to a little diving lure and switch up my retrieve. I'm using something like I love little balsa timber lures when the top water bite is changing. And you can bob those on the surface and then maybe rip them under a foot or so, and that they might get taken the moment they dive under the surface. And you can tell the bass are watching. They're not quite in that mood where they're going to bust through the top, but they're going to grab anything that comes under the surface in that sort of intermittent light period. And then as the shadows are receding, I'm going down and I might be using a deeper crank or a suspending jerkbait or it could be anything. The variety of lures is just endless.
It is.
There's a lot of lure addicts that are born out of bass fishing, and I'm one of them, mate. So it could be a chatterbait, it could be a spinnerbait or a really slowly worked deep plastic, even right along the bottom, just dragged along the bottom in the middle of the day can get those bigger bass too. So that's how I'd go into those light periods, and then it starts to work in reverse as the light falls down the other side during the sunset and then into the night. Into the night, there's no better way to do it than a nice paddling surface lure or something up on the top that just gets busted up on and sends your heart straight through the front of your chest, mate.
Yeah, it does. And look, people say, the problem with fishing at night is much harder to see where you're casting, but I think the flip side of that is that the bass will tend to come away from the cover a fair bit more after dark as well, and they'll be feeding a bit more actively on the surface and they're prepared to move a bit further away. So casting perhaps doesn't have to be quite as accurate. You can get away with that. But I love you mentioned that the bass have such large pupils, and this is one of the things that tells us that it's a nocturnal species. And I did an episode a little while back that was very, very popular about how fish sleep and how to wake sleeping fish. And if you think about the bass's habits, they feed through the night. They are a nocturnal species. They're going to feed around the first light period. They're going to feed around that last light period because that's kind of the last snack before going to bed and the first snack before the evening feed starts, sort of thing. But during the day, they do tend to skulk back down. And so you're right, you need to get those lures down to them. They're going to be a little less active, and they're certainly going to be a little bit deeper in the water column once the sun gets up high. So fish, unlike human beings, our pupils adjust to the light. So if there's too much light, our pupils constrict and reduce the amount of light that's coming in. Fish can't do that. Their pupils are fixed. And bass have got permanently large dilated pupils, which means bright sun really hurts their eyes. So always a good place to look for them is going to be in the shadows. So yeah. Let's move on to tackle. So heading up into these areas, sometimes you're in tight cover, sometimes you've got a little bit more casting room, mate. What would you suggest that we bring along with us in terms of rods, reels, lines and leaders? What's a perfect bass combo?
For me, I run a couple of different setups when I'm out on the water, and if I'm in my kayak, then I'm generally running with at least one spinning outfit, and I tend to run about 10-pound braid and 10-pound leader, and that's on like a 2000 size Stratic with a 702 SF, I think it is. It's just a 7-foot spinning rod that's it might be 3 to 6 kilo, and that still gives me plenty of stick to be able to pull the bass out. But I really like to have just a medium taper so that I do a lot of skip casting, Greg, and I probably didn't touch on this enough early on to really give listeners a picture of how I'm going about my fishing, but a lot of my casting is skip casting, heavy cover and deep, way back, right as far back into fallen timber, undercut tree roots and banks with like curtains of reed and grasses that are hanging over them that most lure fishermen really aren't considering as fair game or capable of getting in there, and that's how I fish. So I tend to fish with a rod that I can get a little bit of skip casting going, whether that's my spinning outfit or I run a heavier setup with my bait casting outfit, which is like a 5'10". It might be 4 to 7 kilo, and it's a fairly medium taper, a short rod, so I can get some good accuracy, but still skip casting with a little 200 Corrado on that. I think it's got 14-pound braid and 14-pound leader, so I can really pull some fish out of some heavy stuff if I need to. And mate, they're probably my go-to setups, and I'll just alternate between those two. Maybe the bait caster with a heavier lure on it, like a weedless frog or something, or a chatterbait or a spinnerbait later in the day. But yeah, early on, I'm fishing fairly sporting stuff for that really tight, heavy cover at about 10 pound.
Mate, I'm going to take a little bit of a sidebar here and talk a little bit more about the skip casting. So You talked about it here for bass. You also talked about it when we talked about mangrove jack. And these are two species where getting your lure right in amongst the cover and right in amongst the structure is critical to your success. So could you give us a few tips for those who aren't familiar with skip casting? Give us a few tips for how to start honing your skills in that area.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, the taper of the rod is important. You want a rod that's got a more whippy or a little bit more flexible medium taper to it at the end. And I sort of go with a blank or a rod that's got a bit of stick down deep where you're holding the rod, because you want to be able to pull the fish out of that cover if you skip casting in, but you need that little bit of load in the top part of the rod so that you can kind of generate some momentum or some inertia where you're flinging that rod as it goes across the surface of the water. You're trying to get low and level with the surface of the water with your cast, and you're flicking that in like skimming the lure like a rock, right in as hard as you can, and you can overshoot that if you're not really skilled. But there's a lot of lures around that are like weedlessly rigged plastics, which is what I use. I use a lot of weedlessly rigged Z-Man finesse frogs is one of my favourites, the little 2.5-inch frog. And that's a surface plastic that floats, and you fling that in. It sits on the surface. You can drag it across mats and lily pads and basically absolutely everything when you've got a rig right. And that skip casting will put you at a huge advantage right throughout the day, where you're picking up fish that rarely get targeted. They're super confident. They might never even see lures in the areas where you can fling it. Like there's sections when you can get a skip lure deep in under a cut bank where you can't even see it. It's that black with shadows, and that's where the bass are super confident.
It's a great skill to develop. It's not just a skill for bass fishing. As I mentioned, mangrove jack, appreciate the lure being right in amongst the structure as well, but even brim fishing around pontoons and that sort of thing, to be able to skip your lure between the pontoon floats, around pylons, all sorts of things, it just gives you the ability to access a lot more water and a lot tighter water where the fish can sometimes be sitting and be a lot more confident about taking a lure.
Yeah, we've got hundreds of pontoons and twin hull boats here on the Gold Coast, and that's where I honed a lot of my game when I was chasing jacks. But just on your point, my PB bass came yesterday skip casting under a yacht, and I'm pretty sure that thing hasn't seen a lot of lures, because the way that it took that bait for that lure for that fish to be that big, I was pretty sure that skip casting was the only way I was going to get it.
Go on, mate. You got to tell us how big your PB bass was.
Did I say bass? I meant to say bream. I pulled a bream yesterday. It was my PB bream. It was somewhere in the early 40s. But PB bass was mid-50s, and I got two of them from the exact same spot, two different trips. And mate, that was fishing in a really small system where we had to carry the tinny a couple of 100 metres just to get it in the water. We put a tinny in because I had two mates with me, and that was just the way it went down. I was fishing deep, actually, on that occasion with a lure I'd never used before. But mid-50s is my biggest wild bass.
Excellent, yeah. And look, those don't come easy in skinny water, that's for sure.
Cheering, mate.
Yeah. All right, John, it's going to get interesting now because, as you've said, this is a species that you could throw about 500,000 different lures at. We're going to narrow those down to just 3 in a moment. But before we do that, just got a quick announcement from the Queensland sport fishers, and then you and I can come back and talk about lures.
Who could imagine a life without fishing? I certainly couldn't. Yet the sport we love is coming under increasing scrutiny, with restrictions and lockouts threatening everything. It is up to us to protect the sport that we love and our way of life. Queensland sports fishers have developed a fishing practices self-assessment questionnaire called Insightful Anglers. Completing the Insightful Anglers questionnaire helps you to stop and reflect on your fishing practices, to demonstrate you are considering best fishing practices, welfare, and care for the environment. If you love your fishing and want to see how your fishing practices stack up, then jump onto www.answerqld.com.au/insightful-anglers. That's www.answerqld.com.au/insightful-anglers and become an insightful angler today. This message was brought to you by the Queensland Sports Fishers.
Okay, folks, we're back at the ALF podcast. Welcome back. We've got John Costello with us. We're talking skinny water bassing in the southeast Queensland area, from the New South Wales border up to the northern end of the Sunshine Coast. And John's given us tons of great information about how to go about finding fish, where to look for them, what tackle to use, and a little bit about when they come on the tube. But John, it is time, mate, to narrow down the lures. This is going to be tough for you, buddy, because I know you've probably got a couple more than 3 lures in your tackle box, and I know that bass will take thousands and thousands of lures. But, mate, if I was to say to you, Let's narrow it down to just 3 that you have to have in your box before you headed off into the skinny water looking for bass.
Yeah.
Could you narrow it down to that many?
I've still got 6 in front of me, mate, but I'm going to do my best because I've had a couple of chances at this podcast, so I need to play by the rules. Mate, what I thought in trying to narrow it down, there are a lot of really good bass podcasts that I've listened to over the last few months on this channel, on this podcast. So I'm going to try and put a little different spin on it from what I've heard so far, just to give some guys some different options that kind of sits with the fishing that I've been talking about. So okay. I mentioned earlier the Z-Man 2.5-inch finesse frog, and that is probably my go-to. Every time I hit the skinny water, I've got one of those on, especially if I'm in my kayak. They're difficult to throw if you're trying to throw across big pools. There's not a lot of weight to them, because it's just a plastic with a little size 1.0 Gamakatsu finesse. It's an offset shank worm EWG hook, which is a mouthful, but when you're throwing something so small, to keep it up on the surface, you need a tiny little finesse hook, and that'll allow it to fish just that little bit better. And you need to run a bit of plastic to keep its chin up so that it doesn't pull under the surface. So there's a little bit in that description here, Greg. I'm sorry.
Can you maybe just expound a little bit on that keeper plastic and how to go about rigging the frog?
Yeah, so because they're so small, and this is part of their appeal, why you can fish them and get aggressive takes all day long. They're a really easy meal. They put out a beautiful vibe on the surface. But to rig this thing, you need these tiny little EWG hooks, and you just want to pin the frog like a tiny little cap. Just catch its chin. The plastic itself is a low-tech material that's not really easy to tear. So you don't have to get a big chunk of the plastic in for it to be rigged right. So I just catch the bottom of the chin, and that leaves the bulk of the frog above where the hook's sitting. And then you run this hook back up through the back of the body, but you need to keep a little bit of plastic. You might have a box, like a plastic box of lures to come in, sitting in your lap or whatever in your tackle box, and I just cut a tiny little square of that, push it over the hook point, and then stuff it up under the chin of the frog that sits on that hook. And that means that as you're fishing it and skipping it, and it's smashing into structure and covering things, the frog's sort of face, its head of the lure, isn't going to fall down onto the hook and then foul up and pull in not right. It leaves the chin up above the surface of the water, and then she just glides straight back across the surface, and that's how you want to fish it. It's not like a popper. It's actually a lure that when you throw out, unlike poppers for bass, which can sit there and just tweak around and leave in the strike zone, I fish this with a medium burn back to the boat, and that's one of the most exciting differences to a lot of other surface lures for bass, is that you try to leave it in front of the bass a lot. This gets them chasing after it. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great, mate. That's an awesome description. And for those who are not familiar, EWG stands for extra wide gape. So these are a hook that have a big, round, curved body. So what it allows you to do by pinning it the way John's described is basically the shank of the hook's almost like a little keel underneath the frog there. So it's going to just keep bumping over things without hooking up. But when a fish grabs it, of course, the point will come home. So that's tremendous. Mate, I guess the point I was going to make is for those who generally target bass in storages and impoundments, just so much food there. The fish, you see how they get. They're big, almost obese fish because there's so much food there and they can get quite lazy. But in a river system, there's not so much food, and quite often the bass or any other species in the river system, if something comes past, they don't really have a lot of time to think about it. They're going to have to grab as much food as they can as it comes past because they have limited options. And so you put something like a little frog in front of them and you move it along at speed, they don't really get time to think about it, and you get those reaction bites that way, which is fantastic. And most people, and myself included, generally are fishing poppers and things a little bit slower. So I loved all of that, and you can guarantee that the next time I'm out skinny water bassing, that's going to be something that I have a crack at. So we've got one down. Tell us about lure number 2.
Lure number 2, I think I mentioned it earlier, which is it's basically any sort of balsa or timber-made lure. And I mentioned I used to use the HJ5 by Rapala, which was a husky jerk floating lure, 5 centimetre long floating lure. But some of my favourites, and you might enjoy this, mate, have been handcrafted lures I've either made myself or I've found from some local lure makers that has a flat balance as it sits at rest. It floats up to the surface and sits flat, just like a little minnow might sit just under the surface. And that's the lure that I'll use after that surface bite starts to slow. And I'll still get it taken off the surface if I'm bobbing it around lily pads or the bank and that sort of thing. But just as it starts to run a lot of the time from its at rest position just under the surface, as I take it off, bang, up she comes, and that's the end of the story. You get these fish smashing these things just as they come under the surface. So any little handmade or, timber balsa lure that's got a big buoyancy to it, they're a lot of fun to work down around structures, floating back up and retrieve them like that, mate. That'd be my number 2, I reckon.
Love all of that, mate. Certainly love that the handmade lures come into play here. And folks, if you've never made a lure before, it's the easiest thing in the world to make a little balsa lure. They don't have to look professional. You can get a bit of balsa from Bunnings or wherever. It doesn't have to be the high-density stuff for this style of fishing. And it's very, very easy to make a lure, to get it to balance. Well, you play around with the hooks and you can put little adhesive weights on the lure if you need to get it sitting just right. Worth the effort to do all that. And it's an amazing feeling to put a lure that you've made yourself in front of a bass and see it get smashed. There's nothing quite compares with that. So, John, 2 down, 1 to go, mate.
All right. Well, the last one, Greg, this is a bit of a curveball, mate, because I haven't actually thrown this for a bass. This is a bit of a bold move. But what I'm going to throw out, I thought I'd take some license because we've spoken about this before, but I've reviewed hundreds of fishing lures now over the years, and this thing has just hit the ground in the last couple of weeks. Now, this is a lure that I was fishing literally yesterday, and the proof's there for me that I think this is going to do really, really well in a similar way to the V-Man finesse rod. There's an MMD soft prawn that's been released. This is a Mick Molnar designed lure. It's a soft prawn that comes in a couple of different weights. Now, the profile on this thing is really, really small, and I think this could be a lure that for someone who goes out bass fishing and is having a hard time of it, this profile is so small that often when people are going out, they're going to have one of those donut days and they need a donut saver. I reckon this could be the lure that gets it done on those slow days. So
this wouldn't be one that took a PB brim the other day, would it?
That's the one, mate. That's the one. And I smashed
I feel it might have been.
So, anyone that's sort of fished for brim and crossed over to bass or the other way around will know that there's some lures that have stood the test of time that cross over between the two. And I get the feeling like this is going to be one of them. The lighter one I can skip, and the heavier ones I think are going to go well in the dams. But it's the small profile that I think is going to save a lot of people's session. If they've got one of these things in, they're having one of those days where they're thinking they've got to get off the water with none in the boat or no photos of any bass. I think this soft prawn could be something that might get people over the line and get them really excited about. The only point I'll say with it is you need to fish it very slow. And I've spoken about a couple of lures in the way that I fish the finesse rods quite quick. This is a very slow lure, almost similar to like a cranker crab where you don't have to impart much action to it. It's all in the profile and the presentation of that lure. And I think these soft prawns are going to excite a lot of anglers and put a lot of smiles on people's faces in the months and years to come, mate. So that's one that's a bit of a prediction, and I thought it was a bit bold doing it, but I just thought I'd share that with you.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Because, of course, as you said, this is a lure that has just been released, so it hasn't been around for all that long, and it's been released while the bass season's closed, so there's no possibility in the skinny water, at least. There's been no opportunity to really test it out. But bloke like yourself, mate, who's caught a lot of bass, caught a lot of brim, and reviewed and tested a lot of lures, has got a pretty good handle on what's going to work. So we'll take that recommendation, no problems at all. Mate, how would you recommend we rig that MMD soft prawn?
Because it's so small, and I think the way that people are going to end up fishing it super slow, you can literally tie right to the tow point, but you want to be running it on fluorocarbon leader, and that'll help it go down and just fit much more naturally on the sink. I got smacked a lot of the time barely moving it as it was sinking, and you're watching your line, all that sort of finesse style fishing where you're really tuned into what your lure's up to and whether it's getting nipped or stalling on the way down and things like that. So if you've got a fluorocarbon leader, it's fairly light, so you're not really hampering that action, I think that's probably going to be the way to go. And
so this is a lure that comes pre-rigged?
Yeah, mate, it's pre-rigged.
Okay.
The little weight is already in it. You can choose between 3 different weights. And just to give you an idea, if you're casting land-based and you're running rock pools, you probably want the middle weight. I think it's 3.5 grams. The really light one, you need to be in a boat, I would say, to be able to fire that thing into cover and reach your target. And then the heavier one, you're probably going to be using that in dams to get down to deeper schools and things like that.
Yeah. Sounds like the jacks might be in a bit of trouble when they start to come on the chew as well with that one.
It's going to do the business. So I've pulled Trevally in the same session, floated all in one session, mate. So it's going to be the business, I think. There's a few lures around that have done that kind of thing, and this is going to be one of them. So something interesting for your listeners that maybe they haven't heard about. Might give them something to try, mate.
Yeah, we'll be Googling that as soon as I get offline here, mate. So, yeah, that's great. And, of course, any small, subtle lure like that is always a good option if you're having a tough day, the fish are being a bit shut down. You need something that they don't have to really think about. A lot of people have said, elephants eat peanuts, but the one I like is, when you've had a big meal and somebody puts a big pile of food in front of you, you're not particularly interested in it, but if they put an after dinner mint in front of you, you might just eat that. So on those shutdown days, one of those little after dinner mints in the form of an MMD soft prawn might be just what the bass are looking for.
That's right. That's right.
Now, John, you've impressed me because you have managed to get it down to 3 lures. So having done that, having put the pressure on you, having forced you to make those decisions, mate, just quickly go through the other 3. We won't go through how to fish each of them, but tell us what the other 3 lures that are in front of you are that you were tossing up to mention.
A jackal squirrel has saved so many donuts for me, a little 67 SP. I've got a 3/8 ounce Hell Yeah chatterbait that fished during the middle of the day, and it's given me a lot of sessions where it's otherwise been turned off, and that's got it done. And then the last one was actually a Dalberg diver or a popper sly, which as a teenager I started to outfish myself with lures, throwing a couple of surface flies that laying the fly out. That presents a whole other challenge, especially in tight waters. So that's another conversation for another day maybe, mate, but that's a really exciting way of doing it too. That's
excellent stuff. That's where the roll casting and bow and arrow casting and all that sort of stuff starts to come in. So good stuff, mate. Look, we're going to start to bring this interview to a close, but before we do that, I just want to touch base as we have in the previous interviews with you about what you're doing online with your YouTube channel and with your website. So for those who haven't found John, it's mylurebox.com.au. So go over and have a look at John's website. Mate, tell us a bit about what you're up to at the moment. What's happening in your world?
Look, I've been running mostly a YouTube channel, and I've been putting videos together, like tips videos, lure reviews, like I spoke about, probably about 8 or 9 years running now. And I'm at a point now with the channel and with my fishing where I'm always looking for new lures to test out and new ways of doing things. But I've started trying to challenge myself and keep learning and put myself in a rookie position. So I've been fishing offshore off a jet ski in the last 6 or 8 months, which has been a huge challenge. And just starting from scratch, basically, and trying to work things out. So even getting back to basics and fishing with baits and working out live bait scenarios before I launch back into the luring game out there, and taking mates out a lot as well. But the work that I've been doing online with the videos, that's been supported by some DVDs that I've produced over the... And it's all really about trying to help people capture their fishing experience and help them along their journey with their lure fishing as well, mate. So we've got very common interest in sentiments, and the idea of providing people with value and helping them catch more fish more often is something that fits right for me as well. So that's what it's all about, mate. And it's been really good. I've got a great audience of people that if you get on there and have a look, I think you'll probably see that. I'm very grateful for that, mate. So it's been going really well.
As I've found, mate, audiences don't come easy. You have to earn them, and you've definitely done that. And you've done some great DVDs, and we've talked about lure reviews and that kind of stuff, but you've also done stuff on species-specific stuff, and you've done stuff on fishing from a kayak and all kinds of really useful stuff. So, folks, particularly if you're fishing in southeast Queensland, but not just in southeast Queensland, other parts of Australia too, go and check out John's stuff, mate. Where's the easiest way to find your YouTube channel? Is it My Lure Box?
Yeah, that's
on YouTube
it. If you
as well.
Type in My Lure Box in a Google search, or if you're on YouTube or the app or whatever, you type in My Lure Box and videos will come up there. And yeah, if there's a species you're after that's in an estuary system or something offshore that you're interested in, or kayak fishing, like I said, there's probably something there for you. And if there's not, let me know, and I'll try and challenge myself to get on it.
You might be opening yourself up for a fair bit of work there, mate, but I'm sure you're up to the task. I've already got some videos I'd like you to produce, so we'll have a chat after this.
Mate, I put it out there to get some people to do some podcasts with me on the water just to talk lures, and I had some blokes turn up beside my boat one day asking to get their hands on all of my lures. They want to swap for a box of lures for a podcast, and so, I've had some stupid ideas at times, but whatever.
Well, a tip for those guys that do try and get their hands on John's lures. I interviewed Dick Pasfield the other day. We were talking about Lake Karanara Barra.
I've listened to that, yeah.
Yeah, and he was telling the story that he had Bushy and Starlo come up and have a fish with him, and he held all his lures out to Bushy and said, okay, which one do you want? And Bushy's picked the oldest, most beaten up, battered lure he could find and said, I'll take this one. I had the fortune to have a chat with Bushy a short time later and said, why did you choose that lure? He said, well, obviously he'd used it a lot. It was his favourite lure, so I was making sure I got the one that was going to catch fish. So there's the tip, guys. Don't look for the nice shiny one. Look for the one that's been worked out and really had a lot of work over the years. So,
mate, there's some pure gold in there. These old blokes that you're getting on here that have been around for a lot longer than me, I'll tell you what, Greg, I have been lapping it up, mate. I'm really grateful for the work you've been doing with these blokes that are on this podcast. So thanks.
Well, I've got to admit, mate, there's a selfish motive as well, because I'm learning every day. I thoroughly enjoy talking to these guys and what goes on the podcast, and then what happens, in the conversations before and after the podcast. There's so much more to it as well. So it's a lot of fun, and I'm glad that you find it useful. And certainly I know that a lot of other people are saying that they're getting value from it as well, which is what keeps blokes like you and I going, mate, and keeps us doing what we do.
Stuff, mate.
So it's good to know that people are getting some value from it. So, folks, I'm going to put some show notes together for this episode. So if you type Costello into the search bar, that's COSTELLO, into the search bar at doclures.com, that's going to bring up this episode. It'll also bring up John's previous episodes on Gold Coast Mega Flathead and Mangrove Jack as well. He's done a few for us now. They've been gold, all three of them. But you'll find this episode there, and there'll be some links to John's YouTube channel and to his website, that kind of thing, his social media as well, if you want to get in touch with him or check out what he does. That'll all be there as well. So, John, it's time to say goodbye. But before we do that, mate, one final question. When we are up in that skinny water and we can see fish, but they are a bit shut down, apart from throwing an MMD soft prawn at them, mate, what's a good way to save a donut day?
I think really light, and I'd go after my little Z-Man 2.5-inch finesse frogs, but throw it up onto the bank and tease it down off the bank. A really subtle land, so you're not spooking it. And then just slow that retrieve right down and just give them plenty of time to think about it. And if you do it enough times, it might take a couple of casts, but that persistence will pay off. And I'm pretty sure you'll work it out. There's a lot of pieces to the puzzle with these bass, but something like that might work, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. And you're right. As long as you're not spooking them, eventually you work it out. And that technique works well with lily pads as well, just quietly. You land the frog on a lily pad, you let it sit there for a bit, give it a twitch to make the lily pad send out a little bit of vibration.
Yeah.
And then after you've done that a couple of times, just plop the frog over the edge of the lily pad and see what happens. Because quite often the old bass is waiting there, watching the lily pad move, waiting for something to drop off the edge, and smack, there it goes. So great stuff, John. It's been brilliant talking to you as always. Hate to have to end the interview. I could keep going forever, but it is that time. So thanks so much for coming along. Thanks for sharing some tips and techniques with us, mate, for targeting skinny water bass in southeast Queensland. Till the next time, look forward to seeing you out on the water sometime.
Thanks, Greg. I'll speak to you soon.
Don't miss a single episode of ALF. Subscribe and rate us on iTunes or jump on the doclures.com